Hello and welcome back to this channel. I'm Ruth, and today we're going to be going through an introductory series in regards to the true and false prophets. So last month I've had the privilege to be able to watch so many videos. I watched so many documentaries, and I was just so shocked and so surprised about literally what is going on in the area that I'm living in. So just a little insight of what I've been watching. I've been watching churches which are basically saying, you know, God blesses you. You know that God blesses you when you have wealth. You know, God blesses you when you have a nice car, you have nice clothes. And I thought to myself, you know, this is not true. And how are people going to be able to distinguish that these things are false? So that really led me to study the topic about the true and false prophets. And I thought to myself, I can't think, you know, that I've arrived when it comes to deception, because the only safety that we have is the written word. So I thought it'd be a great way for me to study and also to increase my knowledge, so that I are not only deceived, but also so I could help others who may be in a similar situation. So based on that note, we're just going to do an introductory in regards to the false and true prophets. And today I want to start with Matthew chapter 7 verse 15. So I've just got my Bible here, and I'll be reading from the New King James Version. And no, I'll be reading from the King James Version, sorry. So yeah, so before we start, we're having this introduction, and I just want to have this question in mind. So as we look to Matthew chapter 7 verse 15, the question that we are going to answer is, you know, so when Christ was here, what was something that he warned his people about? So Matthew chapter 7 verse 15, we see the word beware. So Christ says, you know, beware of something. So we're now going to read this verse, and Matthew chapter 7 verse 15 says, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. And it's very interesting, because I looked at the word, what it means to beware, and it says to be on one's guard against. So Christ is saying, you know, be on guard against, you know, false prophets, because these prophets, they are not just going to be so obvious. They're not going to be like, you know, there is a false prophet, but these false prophets, they look like sheep, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. And I just want to read the Amplified versions, and it's because it's very interesting how it just makes it a bit more clearer, because it says, beware of false prophets, teachers who come to you dressed as sheep, appearing gentle and innocent, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. So we see that Christ is using an analogy between sheep and also with wolves. In the Amplified version, it says, you know, they are sheep appearing to be gentle and innocent, but they are actually ravening wolves. So we see a contrast here, someone who is innocent, tender, compared to someone who is someone who devours, because we know that wolves devour. If you're in an area where you basically have to take out your bin, so weekly here in the UK we have to take out our bins, and sometimes the foxes will come out in the night, and you'll see how the bin will be scattered. Sometimes you think, oh, it might be a cat, but it's usually the wolves. They just come to devour. So we see a big contrast here, that when Christ is saying, you know, to be on one's guard against false prophets, he is saying that because they're not going to be obvious. You know, they're sheep in wolves, they're wolves in sheep's clothing. So we see that it's not going to be obvious. So, you know, in these last days, we're definitely going to need spiritual discernment to be able to distinguish the true from the false. So as we continue with this introduction, I want us to turn to Matthew, still in the same book, but Matthew chapter 24, because in this chapter, it's talking about the signs of Christ's return. And I find it interesting as well, because the disciples in verse 3, they ask Christ a question. They say, tell us when these things shall be, and what shall be the signs of thy coming and of the end of the world. And a very interesting thing about this verse is that Christ is speaking to his disciples. Christ is speaking to believers. So we know that false prophets, they're going to come into the church. They're going to be in the midst of God's people. So that is just something for us to bear in mind. So continuing with Matthew chapter 24, we are answering the question now, what are some signs in regards to Christ coming? What are some things that Christ mentioned to his disciples that are going to show us that Jesus is literally at the door. So we now just want to read Matthew chapter 4, 5, 11 and 24. And we are going to see that Christ warns his people, Christ warns the disciples that when you see false prophets, it means that, you know, I am coming, I am at the door. And just to read, it says, "And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." So we see these false prophets, they're using Christ's name, and they're going to use Christ's name in order to deceive many. And in verse 11 it says, "For many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many." And now verse 24, "For they shall rise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great things and wonders, insomuch, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." So we see that false prophets is not going to be something easy. We really need the spiritual discernment. We need the eye salve spoken of in Revelation chapter 3 verse 18, where it talks about the last church, that they need the eye salve. So to distinguish and to identify these false prophets, we really need to be in our scriptures. We really need to be in the word, because, you know, it says to the law and to the testimony. If these things are not according to it, it means that there's no light in them. So even though we may think, you know, it's so obvious that this is a false prophet because, you know, this person is raising someone from the dead, but we have to remember that it's going to be much more subtle as we get closer to the last days. So in the scriptures, we don't only see Christ give a warning for false prophets, we also see in the book of Acts Paul saying, you know, that when he is leaving, there's going to be false prophets coming in amongst the people. And I just want to read it. So it's Acts chapter 20, I believe it is, verses 29 to 30. So this as well is just showing us that not only Christ talked about false prophets, but also other people in the Bible, such as Paul, made an emphasis about this awareness. Be aware of these false prophets. So it says in verse 29, "For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. And also of your own self shall men arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away disciples after them." So we see not only Christ speaking about false prophets, but we see Paul, and also in the book of 2 Timothy, there's an emphasis of false prophets, also in 2 Peter, in 1 John. So all around the scriptures, we see this emphasis about false prophets. But, you know, you can think, you know, oh, the Bible talks about false prophets, I'm going to not think about prophets at all, I'm going to despise prophecy. But in the Bible, we also see that prophecy is very important. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, I believe it's verse 20, it talks about despise not prophesying. And also we see in Joel chapter 2 verse 28, and also Acts chapter 2 verse 17, it talks about how the sons and daughters shall prophesy in the last days. So we see that even though we are in the last days, and Christ is saying, you know, beware of false prophets, but we also see that God is going to use prophesying in these last days to glorify himself and to also bring people to him. So we see that it doesn't just say beware of all prophets, but just the false ones. So in this series, I want us to be able to look through, you know, so that we can be able to distinguish the true from the false, because we have to look by the scriptures and see, you know, whether these things are so. So to make an end, actually not to make an end, I still got some verses to read. But just to make an emphasis as well, that prophecy is not something, you know, that we can throw in the bin, but we also, you know, when it's in line with God's word, it's something that is a blessing. Because we see in Amos chapter 3 verse 7, it talks about, surely the Lord will do nothing, but he revealeth his secret. Surely the Lord will do nothing, but he revealeth his secret unto his servants, the prophets. And also in the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, we see how the remnant, the people of God, the last church, had the spirit of prophecy. Because in Revelation chapter 12 verse 17, the remnant have two things. They have, you know, the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus. And if we were to turn to Revelation chapter 19 verse 10, we would see that the testimony testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So we see that prophecy is such a blessing. So we see, you know, that prophesying, when it is in alignment with God's will, it is a blessing. So I'm just making an emphasis based on that even though we see, you know, beware of false prophets, in God's order, in God's plan, prophesying is actually for the edification of God's church in these last days. So during this series, by God's grace, we're going to look at the characteristics of the false prophet, the true prophet, and also the test for a prophet. And by God's grace, we are going to see a last day prophet which God has used, and how this prophet fills all the requirements for a true prophet. So have a blessed day. Next week we'll be going through Deuteronomy chapter 18 verses 10 and 11, I believe it is, but if not, I'm gonna write something here just to show you the right verses. By God's grace, we're going to take it step by step through those verses, because we see that in Deuteronomy chapter 18, God was raising a prophet, and he had to enlighten his people about the prophets which were not of God. And one of those prophets were, you know, witches and wizards, those who, you know, are speaking with the dead. So we're going to look at some of those things next week. So in the meantime, have a blessed week. Shalom, and may the Lord be with you till we meet again. Shalom. So greetings. So here I'm just showing you the link of my blog. So by God's grace as well, I will be putting out a text format in regards to what we've been learning in regards to the true and false prophets. So the link for that will be in the description box. So if you want to, you can read it, and sometimes just reading it as well can be a bit clearer. So see you next time. We'll be discussing more about this topic, and it's my prayer, you know, that we will be able to say the truth has set us free.